welcome you all. Thanks for being here. You've made it to another Friday. Are there only 3 more Fridays left? Something like that. I haven't counted, but it's got to be getting there. First of all, let me say, for those of you that are dressed up for Halloween, I do like all of your costumes. And don't say you like my costume, because I wear this every day, and so it's not meant to be a costume. So anyways, let me start by returning some graded homework, and then we'll look at the homework that you have for today. So.
Thank you.
So, for today, you had some exercises to complete on workbook pages, I think it's 39 and 40. And let me double check my notes here. Yeah. Today I decided not to. And part of the reason is because I'll need to be here for many hours adjudicating senior recitals, and I just don't know that I'll have the time to get them all graded in time. So, but we are going to go over the answers. We definitely are going to go over the answers, and we're going to do that right now. So if you'll turn to page 39 in your workbook, I want you to check to see if your types of motion match my types of motion. Remember last class we talked about how there are 5 types of motion, one of which is called static. It's not really any motion at all. But based on this little 4-chord passage, I hope you got, according to the directions, number 1, I hope you got OCC. Number 2, COC. Number 3, OCC again. Number 4, ST, followed by PP. And 5 was OOS, and 6 was OOS also. I was so tempted for number 4, I was so tempted to put an O right in between the ST and the P. And then I wasn't going to do number 5 and 6 tonight, but I trained myself. So. Let me know, does anyone have any questions about at least analyzing or identifying this type of motion between the various pairs of voices we have in the 4-voice texture? Okay. Then let's go to the next page, and I'll show you where your examples of errors should be found. Just so you know, I asked you to cross out or ignore number 3, which asks you to find the direct fifth. I'm not going to be talking about those at all. And then there was one instance or one error of each of the remaining that are listed. Okay? So I found right between the first 2 chords, I found contrary fifths. And just to show you that, the reason is because the bass and the soprano in the first chord are a perfect fifth apart. B flat to F. They both move to new notes, which in the second chord, the same 2 voices, bass and soprano, create once again a perfect fifth, F to C. So that is incorrect when you have a perfect fifth between 2 voices in one chord, and a perfect fifth between the same 2 voices in the next chord. And those notes, that new perfect fifth is on different pitches. It cannot be allowed either parallel motion or contrary motion. And you see how the bass moves down and the soprano moves up between chord 1 and 2. That's an example of contrary motion. So fifths in both cases between the same pair of voices arrived at by contrary motion. That's not correct. I found an instance of parallel fifths between the bass and the alto voice moving from chord 3 to chord 4. You have a perfect fifth between those two voices in both chords. D to D in this chord, E to B, E flat to B flat between the same two voices in the next chord. So there's parallel fifths, and that's wrong. You can see my spacing error I just circled is between the soprano and the alto. On beat 4 of the first measure, that's over an octave, and those two voices are always supposed to be an octave or less away from each other. And then finally, the parallel octaves were found, if you look between the bass and the soprano, going across the bar line from measure 1 into the next measure. In the first chord here, we have E flat to E flat, that's a perfect octave. In the very next chord, the same two voices produce an octave, B flat to B flat. So this is just a little bit of this is trying to get you to look for and identify and know what these errors are so that in the future you do not write these same errors yourself. That's the idea. You want to avoid writing these things when you do your own voice leading and part writing. The next one, all of the errors were in the second half of the example. So number 1 was a set of parallel octaves. I hope you can see that between the alto and the tenor voice going across the bar line. A to A is an octave, they move to new notes, the same two voices produce an octave, G to G. That is incorrect. Number 4, since it's circled right there, that is supposed to be a spacing error. Notice that the alto is more than an octave away from the tenor note, and that is never permitted. The alto and tenor must always be an octave or less away from each other at all times in every chord. And then finally, number 2 was an example of parallel fifths. The bass and the alto are involved in this error, so the bass and the alto, D to A, they form a fifth, and they move to new notes, which form a fifth between those same two voices again, bass and alto, and the next chord, A to E, create a perfect fifth. So there's perfect fifths in both of those chords between the same two voices. Yes?
What if I labeled a perfect fifth error in the second to first, or the first to second measure with the last note to the first note?
Okay, the first to second measure?
Yeah. With the tenor and soprano voice.
Okay, that's a very good, I'm glad you observed that. In this case, note that it's really close to perfect fifths, but do you notice how the tenor and soprano in this beat here, C sharp to G is a diminished fifth technically? What do we, I believe I mentioned this, what did I call it when you have a diminished fifth in one chord move to a perfect fifth, or vice versa? In other words, one of the fifths is diminished and one of them is perfect. Do you remember what that's called? Unequal fifths, that's right. Unequal fifths are allowed unless the bass is involved. And in this case, it's between the tenor and soprano, so they're allowed in this case. But yeah, that's very close. You're very close. I mean, I know that sometimes in theory we split hairs. But technically, if that was a C natural now, then I would definitely mark that as bad parallel fifths. Perfect fifths. Good. Are there other questions or comments about any of these problems here? Yes, this is one of those assignments that I should have collected, right? I should have collected this one. Well, I'll tell you what, I can guarantee you I'm going to collect the next one. All right, if there are no questions, comments, or concerns about this, you can hang on to that. We'll move on. We've got a lot more information to learn about part rating. Remember, I don't want you to think that, why do I have to do this part rating? It seems like such like busy work. But, this, if you're really into music, this is an art, this is a craft. It takes time to learn a craft. It takes time to learn art. So, trust me, by the time you get out of theory, you'll have all the tools you need to be a good voice leader or a good part writer. So, today we're going to start by talking, we're actually going to do some part writing. That is, we're going to go connect the voices that are in one chord, and we're going to move them to notes appropriately or correctly to the notes of another chord. And these two chords, their roots are going to be a fourth or a perfect fifth apart. Okay. Let me see if I can put this on the board. When we start learning part writing, we need to start with restricting ourselves to dealing with chords that are only in root position. I'm not going to even start talking about how to part write chords that are inverted until almost the last week of classes. So we got a good week at least on this. And the author goes into talking about how when two chords are in root position, right, and they're not the same chord, they're different chords, then the root has the possibility to move in only just a few different intervals. The roots can move, as you see here. The two chord roots can be a second apart, they can be a third apart, they can be a fourth apart. And if they are second apart, the voice leading or the part writing rules are the same as if the roots were a seventh apart. Seventh is the inversion of the second, remember? If two chords have roots a third apart, the part writing is the same as if their roots were a sixth apart. And if two roots are a fourth apart, the part writing is the same as if their roots were a fifth apart. Okay. And then we don't have to worry about same roots at all, a repeated chord. We're not going to necessarily deal with that. So I'm going to start by actually going through teaching us today how to do part write between two chords whose roots are a fourth or a fifth apart. Because the part writing is the same for both types of root distance. Okay, first of all, when you part write a triad or chord, all members of the triad need to be present, and the root of the chord should be doubled. So, as an example, I'll just pick a C major triad for ease, I guess. This would be one proper way to voice a C major triad. First of all the members of the chord have to be present. C, E, and G. Okay? I don't want you leaving any help, at least not yet. Not only do all members of the chord have to be present, but you need to, as I've said in many classes now, you need to make sure that the root of the chord is duplicated or doubled. And what that means is that, well, how do I say this here? Two of the four parts should be given the root of the chord. In other words, in this case, C is the root of the chord, two of the four parts need to have a C. That way we say the C is doubled. Another way we can say that is that the root of the chord is doubled. Now, there is one exception to the doubling rule. Well, there's one exception to basically everything I just said here. Let's say, for instance, that you're at the very end of a passage that you're part writing, or the very end of some kind of exercise or problem that I assigned for homework. If necessary, if sometimes you can do this, you are allowed to, for the very last chord of a passage, a problem or an exercise, you are allowed to triple the root, and you're allowed to leave out the fifth of the chord. That's one exception to what I just said over there. All the other chords that you part write, they need to have all of their members, all three pitches, and the root needs to be doubled. Only, as an exception to the rule, only the very last chord in an exercise or some kind of passage that you're part writing can you have the root tripled and the fifth of the chord omitted. So what does that look like if we're dealing with C, E, G? Well, the fifth of the chord is G. You're allowed to omit the fifth of the chord. And in place of that note, you're allowed to put another root in the chord. So do you see how in this case I have a triple group? And what that means is 3 of the 4 parts have the pitch of the root, that is C in this case. You see how there's a C in the bass, a C in the tenor, and a C in the soprano. So from this we can understand a few things. Number one, is it ever okay to leave out or omit the third of a triad? Never. Is it ever okay to omit or leave out the root of a triad? Absolutely never. Is it ever okay to have one root in a 4-voice texture?
Wait, no. It has to be
No, it's got to either be doubled or, in rare cases, tripled. You can never have just one. Not in root position triads. And that's all we're dealing with right now. Now, I did see a few hands. Was there a question?
I just wanted you to play it, but
Oh, okay.
or just a comparison of all of them, and then the without.
Yeah, so the first one that I have sounds like this. The one I have at the very end sounds like this. See, when you have a root and a third, it doesn't sound incomplete, really, even though it is a little incomplete. Okay, so for instance, I could see, for instance, having a sound that goes from this to this. That sounds fine.
Also, can you play it the wrong way with like not doing the E or not doing the C?
Oh, yeah, I suppose. Let me think about this. So here's a chord with no third in it. You can't tell whether it's major or minor, because it has no definition, it's got no third. And if I play a chord with no root in it at all, that's going to sound something like this. I don't even know, let's try this. You can't leave out the root. The root always has to be present. Even one root is helpful, but that's still not preferred doubling for a root position. So, I guess the moral of the story is, for all of the chords that you write, you need to have all the members of the triad present. You need to double the root, because we're all just root position chords. Only the very last chord in an example can have the 5th of the triad omitted and the root tripled.
Does the soprano have to be? Can that one be the one that's the third per se, or
Yeah, it can.
it doesn't matter which one?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there was one. Yeah, let's look at this. This is on page 80 of your book. This little part writing example is in the key of A major. And you see how in the final chord, that A major chord, you see how there are 3 A's, there's 1 C sharp, there's no E. So that's a case where the 5th of the triad, the A, C sharp, E, the 5th of the triad is omitted, and the root is tripled. And that's allowed as the final chord. That's allowed. Okay. I know there's a lot of weird rules, weird idiosyncrasies about part writing, but again, it's just kind of like learning a language again. There's all these different little things to remember. And you'll get the hang of it the more we go through it. Okay? So, the next thing I need to tell you is this. Whenever we part write a chord, if the chord contains scale degree 7 or the leading tone, we never, ever, ever double the leading tone. So for instance, if I part write a 5 chord, or if I voice a 5 chord in the key of C, I know that this chord contains the pitches G, B, and D. Do you see how B, it contains its scale degree 7 of the key of the scale that we're working in? Okay. We also know that from the last unit, this is the leading tone, scale degree 7. Also, in aural skills, I refer to it as T. T. You can never double that pitch. Never double that pitch. So and you wouldn't do it anyway. So for instance, let's say you have G, and then you have another G, and then you have a B, and then you have a D. This is perfect. This is perfect because all 3 members of the triad are present, And the root of the chord, the G, is duplicated. I've got a G in the bass and a G in the alto. But under no circumstances would you ever do something like this. You get a lot of points taken off if you ever double the leading tone or scale degree 7 of the key that you're working in. The reason is because T is the strongest tendency tone of the scale. It's a high maintenance pitch, very, very high maintenance. You got to be careful the way you use the pitch. Now I hope you understand that B in this case is the 7th degree of C major, the scale, but it's the 3rd of the chord. I hope that doesn't confuse you. You're just not supposed to double the 7th degree of the scale. And then also, since T, scale degree 7, is such a high maintenance pitch, if T occurs in an outer voice, for instance, let me go back to correct doubling on this one. Do you see how scale degree 7 of the key, do you see how it's in an outer voice? I consider an outer voice to be the soprano or the bass. Those are outer voices. The inner voices are the alto and the tenor. If scale degree 7 or T of the key is in an outer voice, the very next chord that you part right, T has to go up by a half step to scale degree 1 or do. It has to. That's a law or a rule, a hard rule in part writing. So if you want to think of this as the leading tone or scale degree 7, when it's in an outer voice, when it's exposed, either in the soprano or the bass, and we're not going to have it in the bass until we start dealing with chords in inversion. But when it's in an outer voice, it has to go up by a half step. It has to go rise to do, because it's got such a strong tendency and affinity to go to that stronger pitch, do. Don't worry, I'll give you a sheet that'll remind you about all these tricks, these rules. Okay, let me change the voicing of this G major chord one more time. In which voice is T, or scale degree 7? Where is it found now in this measure? The tenor voice, right? And the tenor voice is classified, along with the alto, as an inner voice. If T appears in an inner voice, as it does here, it does not have to go up by a half step to its do, to scale degree 1. It has the freedom or the option to go down. For instance, I could do something like this. It has the freedom to go down, or it still can go up if it wants to. It has the prerogative to go any direction it wants. And then I would probably do something like this. So when T is in an inner voice, it's that high maintenance pitch, scale degree 7, it can go up or down. It has the freedom to do either. But when it's in an exposed outer voice, like the soprano, then the very next chord, it has to go up by half step. It can't go any other direction. It can't go to any other note.
For like the inner voices like tenor, does it have to go to a do, just doesn't matter which one, or is it can go to any note?
You mean this one here?
Yeah.
Usually what all the notes do in one chord, they usually move, not all the time, but they generally move to the nearest chord tone, whatever the next chord is. So the choice for this B here, it can go up or down. If it goes up, it would go to C. If it goes down, it would go to G. It's not going to go to, because by the way, this is supposed to be a C major chord, if that wasn't clear. Yeah, it usually moves to the nearest chord tone. And so if I play that particular measure, I have this going to this. And the leading tone in the tenor just goes up a half step. But it could go down, it could go like this. And in that case, my harmony would sound. It's allowed to do that.
Play the soprano way? With the soprano on T?
The soprano is not on T in any of those chords.
If it,
Oh, you want me to play the one with?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if the soprano's on G, yeah, you have this. See, right, if you're in the key of C, what if I don't play do? I mean, is that going to incite everyone to like, I don't know. But I mean, so when you hear G in an outer voice, it's got to go up to do. If I don't, if I take it to some other note, like this, just kind of like, oh, what a letdown. You know, how sad, how sappy. That was just unsatisfying, dissatisfying, whatever you want to say. But when it's in an outer voice, it's got to go up a half step. I hope your ear kind of agrees with some of these guidelines, these rules. Okay, let me give you one of the most important handouts that any theory student in any semester of theory ever gets, and that is 15 primary part writing rules that must be followed. I even put it on a different color paper so you don't get it lost among all your other white papers. And this year it happens to be goldenrod. Other years it's pink, other years it's green, blue, whatever, I don't know. It just happens to be goldenrod this year. Did everyone get one? By the way, if you want like, 25 of these so that you can wallpaper your dorm room, that's
That would be
totally
great.
fine. Okay. All right, so let's look. We haven't covered all of these rules yet, but we've covered a lot of them. Number one, never ever write consecutive parallel unisons, perfect fifths, or perfect octaves. Number two, never write consecutive contrary perfect fifths or perfect octaves. We talked about that last class. Number three, I just got through explaining. When the leading tone of the key, or T, you can call it, if it's in an outer voice, it must resolve or move up a half step to tonic in the next chord. Number four, the leading tone of the key must never be doubled in a chord. We talked about that. 5 and 6 we talked about a couple classes ago. The space between the soprano and alto must always be an octave or less. And the space between the alto and tenor must be an octave or less at all times. Number 7 and 8 we've also addressed. We don't want to cross voices. In other words, do not put the alto voice higher than the soprano ever, and do not write the tenor voice below the bass. Rule number 9 we have not addressed. We'll do that in another class. Number 10 we've talked about, keeping the voices in their ranges. Number 11 is kind of redundant. It just says do not cross the voices. Hey, number 12 and 13 we just talked about today. All chords must contain a root. And you think it's probably silly that I put this on here, but if you're part writing quickly or you're trying to rush to get something done, you wouldn't believe how many chords I see with students they turn in and there's not even a root in the chord. The same thing with the third. It happens by accident, right? If you're not paying attention, you just accidentally leave out the third of the chord and then I have to mark it. And then number 14, double the bass note of a tri in root position. That is double the root. Means the same thing. 15 we'll get to another day, but we've got most of these now we've talked about. Okay? So, hang on to that. Again, you can use that as reference whenever you need to, if you forget some of the rules about part writing, and there are quite a few rules to part writing. So now what I need to do to finish off today is I need to start telling you how to take the notes and the voices from one chord to another chord whose root is a fourth or a fifth apart. There are 3 acceptable ways to do this. And yeah, I'm just gonna, let me just do it from here. I'll do it on the board. I'm gonna stay in the key of C. Okay, everything on the goldenrod or the yellow sheet that you have is what I consider a hard and a fast rule. They can't be broken. Okay? What I'm going to tell you now is I'm going to give you three, I don't want to say suggestions, it's a little more than that. I'm going to give you three guidelines for taking the notes of a one chord, of any chord, and going to a chord whose root is a fourth or fifth away. And these guidelines, if you follow them, you will never have any errors, like parallel fifths or octaves, or unresolved T's or double T's, things like that. You won't have those errors if you follow any of these three guidelines, okay? So these guidelines are meant to help you. Now, how far apart are the roots to these two chords? They're a perfect fifth apart, right? G down to C. Okay. One guideline, and I call this guideline number one, and it's even listed in your book on page 83. One of the guidelines says to properly take the top three voices over to fill out this C, E, G chord. What you do is you'll notice that whenever two root position chords exist whose roots are a fourth or fifth apart, they will always share one common tone. They'll always have one tone in common. So think about this. This 5 chord in this key is G, B, D. This chord here is C, G. What's the one pitch that's shared between the two chords? G, right? You'll always have one common tone between two chords whose roots are a fourth or fifth apart. Always. So, guideline number one says, find the tone that's in common and don't move it at all as you go to the next chord. Keep it static. So where's the G? And don't count this one because the bass is already taken care of. Which voice is the G in? The alto, right? So the guideline number one says just don't even move it to another pitch. Keep it static or stationary. And put that same pitch exactly where it is in the next chord, because it's a tone that's in common between the two harmonies. Sometimes to show static motion, which is no motion at all, or stationary motion, sometimes I use dotted lines. The book uses ties, but you don't have to tie the notes together. The rest of guideline one says then, okay, after you've kept the common tone stationary, take the other two remaining pitches and move them in the same direction to the nearest chord tone. Now, you tell me. I'm trying to fill out a C, E, G chord, right? And I have to have the C doubled. So it looks like I've got a C and a G. I need an E and another C, right? These two notes here, the ones that are left, happen to be the soprano and the tenor. We're going to move them in the same direction to the nearest chord tone. Okay. Can anyone see which direction the tenor and the soprano are going to have to move?
Up.
Yeah, they're going to go up. Because if I move them both up, this goes to an E and this goes to a C. And I've got the exact notes I need with the proper doubling in the second chord. Also, there's another reason why I have to take the soprano up. Why did I have to take the soprano up?
Because it was on a B and the...
Because it's scale degree 7 and it's in an outer voice, so it absolutely has to go up. There's no other option for that note. But to summarize, I want to just tell you, and I'll sometimes use arrows to show you what should be done here. Guideline number one. Again, it's on page 83 in your book if you want to ever refer to it or read it. It says, when your chord roots are a fourth or fifth apart, find the one tone that's in common between the two chords and slide it over. Don't move it. Keep it static. Then the other two remaining pitches you have left, move them in the same direction to the nearest tones that belong in your destination chord, in your goal chord. And that's what guideline 1 says. And if you do that, you will never have any errors on your yellow goldenrod sheet. You just won't. Anyone have questions about guideline number 1? Let's take a look at guideline number 2. By the way, there are 3 guidelines for this root movement. Staying in the key of C. This time let's go to a 4 chord, because the root of a 4 chord is either 4th or 5th away, depending on whether you go up or down. What are the notes in C major? What are the notes of a 4 triad? Anybody? Isn't it FAC? It helps to know what notes you need in the chord you're trying to write and trying to go to. All right, guideline number 2 says, even though there's a tone in common between these 2 chords, you don't keep the common tone in this one. What you do is you move all 3 upper parts in the same direction, and no leap is larger than a third for any of these parts. All right, so basically this is saying I'm either going to take these top 3 voices, tenor, alto, soprano, I'm going to have them move all down to get notes of the 4 chord, or I'm going to have them move all up to get to the notes of the 4 chord. And none of these voices is going to have to leap or skip more than a third. That's what it's saying. What do you think? Do you think I should go up, or do you think I should go down? Which one requires the least amount of jumping or skipping for all those 3 voices? Well, in this case, it's going to be, they're all going to go down. If I take the C down, what's the nearest chord tone? F, A, or C? And I can't stay on the C. What's the nearest chord tone? A, right? That means these have to go down as well. What's the nearest chord tone? F, A, C, below this E. C. And what's the nearest chord tone, F, A, or C, below this G? You see how it gets you exactly what you need? I have an F, an A, and a C, and the root is doubled. I have 2 F's. So they all moved in the same direction with no leap larger than a third. That's what guideline number 2 says. And if you follow this guideline, you'll be free from errors on your goldenrod sheet. You won't have parallel fifths or octaves. You will have the right doubling. You will not have cross voices. All these are good things. That's what guideline number 2 says. Okay? Finally, guideline number 3. Let's see here. Let's just do this one. I'm going to voice my C chord like this. We're going to go to a 4 chord again. The roots are 4th part, number 4th or 5th, it doesn't matter, the part writing is the same. Part writing guidelines are the same. And guideline number 3 says this: keep the common tone static. So kind of like rule 1, or guideline 1 I should say. What is the common tone between a C major triad and an F major triad? What's the one pitch that they share? The C. That's right. So guideline number 3 says, well, find the common tone and keep it static. Don't move it. No motion at all. It stays on C in the next chord. But unlike guideline number 1, which says move the remaining 2 voices by step in the same direction, guideline number 3 says find the note that is the third of the chord. How's it? The voice that has the third of the chord in the first chord leaps to provide or produce the third of the chord in the second chord. Okay? So, again, it helps sometimes to know what chord you're looking at and what the tones are. C, E, G. which pitch is the third of the chord?
C.
The E, right? In what voice is the E found in this first chord? It's in the soprano, right? FAC, what note is the third of this chord? The A. So what the guideline 3 is saying is after you keep the common tone static, find the note that's the third of the first chord, which happens to be the E right here in the soprano, and make it leap all the way until it becomes the third of the next chord. So E is going to leap all the way up to A. See, the third of the first chord leaps to become the third of the second chord. And then the remaining voice that you have left to get from here to here, it moves by step. Well, what else do I need in this chord? I got an F, an A, and a C. I need another F, right? Can I just take the tenor G? Can I take it down and do that? Because adjacent voices can share the same pitch. That's permitted. So now I have two Fs, bass and tenor, a C in the alto, and a C in the soprano. Rule, I keep saying rule. Guideline number 3 is the least smooth of all the 3 guidelines. And the reason I say it's the least smooth is because one of the voices besides the bass, one of the upper voices has to leap a fourth. The less you have to leap when you go from chord to chord, the more stepwise, the more static, the more common tones you can keep. That is smoother. That's most desirable. But the fact that this voice is leaping a fourth makes this guideline the least smooth compared to the other 2. Because no voice besides the bass, no upper voice has to leap as much as a fourth or even larger in any of those first 2 guidelines. So when I talk about smooth voice leading from one chord to another, we're striving to get either no motion at all, static motion. We're striving to get stepwise motion if we can, or small leaps of a third. Okay. This is just one exception. One of the voices has to leap a fourth, but this is in the book, and the book says that this is allowed. You can use it, and so we're going to use it. It's acceptable. It's acceptable. Okay. I think I need to play these now so you can hear how they sound. Let's see. I think that one is over here. Yeah, the first measure in the key of C sounds like this. That's correct part right. Guideline number 2 sounds like this. And finally, guideline number 3 sounds like this. Guideline number 3, another fact about it, is that it's going to change your overall chord's structure when you use guideline number 3. You notice how the structure of the first chord happens to be closed structure. You see the tenor is less than an octave away from the soprano. But when I implement and I use guideline 3, the next chord is going to be the opposite structure. So this is closed structure, but this chord is open structure. You see how the soprano and the tenor are over an octave apart? So guideline 3 will always change your chord structure. And it doesn't matter because you can use closed or open structure at all times. But just so you know, that's what it does. It'll change you from open to closed or closed to open structure. That's what it does if you implement that guideline correctly. All right, now, let me find my notes here. What I want to do, we only got 5 minutes, but oh well. Can you take your goldenrod rule sheet, can you turn it over to the back side? And I want us to take a little bit of time, we got 5 minutes yet. I want us to take some time and look at the first The first part rating example is the top right. The top right. And it says there to identify the error from the list provided by putting the correct number in the box. Let me get this up on the screen. Right there. I want you to look at that. And you've got a list of what, 8 errors off to the left? Who can tell me what's the one error in this example that makes it not so good? And again, errors are the things that you find on your goldenrod sheet. It sounds like this. Did you find one?
They double the G.
Yeah, in the second chord, right? So what number for what error would you put in that box?
3 doubling.
That's right, you put 3 doubling. Okay, so put 3 in the box. That tells you there's a doubling error in the second chord, the 5 chord. Okay. How about the next one? Oops. Let me play it first real quick. See if you can tell me what the part writing error is. It's in the key of G minor. And it sounds like this. Do you know?
The 7 doesn't resolve correctly.
That's right. The leading tone of the key, you know, we're in G minor. You see how F sharp is scale degree 7? That's in an outer voice in the first chord. It's not going up by half step as it should. Okay, so what error number is that? 6?
Yeah. You should make it number 7 next time.
Yeah, I suppose I could. 7's going wild. I think that's error number 6 though.
Yeah.
So you want to put that in the box. And then finally the last one. What is the part writing error located in this example? If I can play it quickly. We have going to this. You know?
Is it parallel fifths or is it contra fifths?
It's parallel fifths. What voices are you looking at? Which voices contain parallel fifths? Going from the first chord to the second chord. That's right, it's the soprano and the bass. You see how the bass to soprano in chord 1, E to B is a perfect fifth? And then in the next chord, the bass and the soprano again, A to E, they create a perfect fifth. So that's bad, that's parallel fifths, and that's error number 1.
It doesn't matter then that they're an octave apart or more than an octave apart, right?
Correct. So in other words, you're thinking that they're really parallel 12ths?
Yeah.
Yes, that does not matter. We don't deal with compound intervals when we look at that. Just reduce everything to an octave or a fifth if that's, how do I say that? Everything is treated as an octave or a fifth if you can, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that this is, just because the E in the bass and the B in the soprano are technically a 12th apart, don't worry about that, just call it a fifth. Just call it a fifth for our purposes. And that's a good way to find parallel octaves and fifths. Okay, so we're running out of time. Now, the homework assignment that I have for you for Monday it's just one-sided. Number 1, it's going to ask you to find a part writing error in the part writing given on the left. And then it's going to ask you to state or list the error. And then it's going to ask you to part write the whole thing correctly without the error. Okay? Now, remember, just because something doesn't use or follow guideline number 1, 2, or 3, I want to stress that's not an error. An error is something that goes against something on this sheet. You got it? So anything you list as an error has to be something that goes against this sheet. It's not an error to not use guideline 1, 2, or 3. It's to suggest that you use these so that you don't create the errors. That's kind of how that works. All right, so this is for Monday. And I guess when you can get this, you can go ahead and do it, since we're full on time. All right, have a good weekend.